The relation between politics and the literary and cultural revival and/or Renaissance, whether in Ireland, Scotland, Haarlem, Bengal, or elsewhere, is often spoken of as something held in question. Can there possibly be any direct influence from the scribblers and the dabblers and the tinklers upon ivory and the violence of revolutionaries, or the daily practice of professional politicians, or the outflow of mass media? The answer to that depends upon whether the revolutionaries and politicians read, look at, or listen to works of art, and also whether the artists are educators, journalists, politicians, or take part in social revolution directly. And if they do, the influence is there, and if not, not. But of course, it goes deeper. And the question raises matters that are more pervasive and permeating than can be neatly summarized. Kenneth Buffley, in his book on MacDiarmid, says simply, the interrelationship between his work and the rise of Scottish nationalism, an altogether deeper matter than the recorded history of political parties, will always be beyond calculation. Maybe the most familiar writer who is central to this debate is W.B. Yeats, and the statues in 1938 asking, when Pearse summoned Cuchulainn to his side, what stalked through the post office, bringing the Easter Rising in Ireland into the realm of myth and Cuchulainn into that contemporary political confrontation. The violence that actually happened is neither endorsed nor condemned by the poem or by the later poem relating directly to Easter 1916. But the idea of terrible beauty being born is left in a condition of ambiguity and questioning. Such beauty arises from the depths of history, and the poems imply the sad and bitter question of who might be capable of seeing and appreciating such beauty these days. Who has such discrimination? In moments of revolutionary upheaval, certain writers are usually quick to grasp how important live dramatic performance can be. Their work frequently precedes and imagines what might follow. In the Dublin Post Office in 1916 at Easter, the post office itself was the most symbolic site for the exchange of information. And this had been preceded by the foundation of the Abbey Theatre in 1903, itself a development of the Irish literary theatre, which had been founded by Yeats, Lady Gregory, and others in 1899. The theatre wasn't built with the idea of prefiguring bloody revolution, opposing the British Empire, but in retrospect, questions arise. Much later, also in 1938, reflectively, Yeats asks himself rhetorically in the poem The Man and the Echo, whether the sentiments he expressed in his play Kathleen the Houlihan, first performed in 1902 in Dublin, inspired revolutionary action. Did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot? We might say, probably not. But can we be sure? Many of those the English shot were indeed highly literate, literary, culturally educated, cultivated people. But there's a flaw in the argument, a flaw in the question itself. Again, Kenneth Buffley makes the point succinctly with reference to MacDiarmid. Direct political purpose in literature is usually referred to as propaganda. In his poem, Poetry and Propaganda, MacDiarmid writes, in short, any utterance that is not pure propaganda is impure propaganda for sure. Buffley comments, now it's arguable that all art is propaganda, but some specimens of this propaganda are better art than others. And there are further distinctions that have to be made. For example, it may be argued that Coleridge's Ancient Mariner is propaganda, but it is not propaganda on behalf of a society for the prevention of cruelty to albatrosses. Two things emerge from these considerations. One is the provenance of poetry, of literature, and the arts, and their relation to political actions, of which we've learned to refer to in the world of realpolitik, The world Edwin Morgan describes in his poem on John Maclean, where he acknowledges that if the goods get damaged in transit, you make do. You do. And don't be so naive about this world. But the other thing that emerges is a twofold context in which envelops the question of the relation between the cultural revival or renaissance of the political world. And that twofold context comprises, one, education, and two, public discourse. By education here, I mean principally formal education through educational institutions. That's to say, education sanctioned, approved, and funded by governments. We're all familiar with the practice and ideals of lifelong learning, but I'm talking literally now about what the national curriculum is or is not, what children are taught in schools. And if I can share my screen now for a moment, I'll give you an image of what I'm talking about. So this is, it's worth reminding ourselves, front page of the Herald from January 2012, when it's now 11 years, only 11 years, since Scottish literature was embedded in the school's curriculum, to the extent that it is or has been. There was still resistance to it, there was plenty of resistance to it then. And the idea that in Scotland, in the schools in Scotland, the children in the schools in Scotland were not necessarily introduced to the literature of this country was redressed at that point to the extent that it was. But it's by no means a finished story. So by public discourse, and this extends from the world of education into the world of the newspapers, where we're looking at this image, I mean literally what people choose to talk about, to be concerned about, and what people care about, which inevitably means mass media. What's in the news? Where's there room to talk about anything else? There is no calculation, to use Kenneth Buckley's word, that could convincingly demonstrate this. But recent comment about the inadequacies of Radio Scotland, the priorities of newspapers, the generation of polarization in social media platforms, the ways in which particular forms, genres, and predilections have been moved forward and taken up in a media exploiting the opportunities of lockdown, pandemic disease, disunited peoples, warring clans, all these are simple demonstrations of the fact. You turn on the TV and go to work. One specific example, why is it that in the 1970s and 1980s there were a number of television adaptations of major Scottish literary works, including Bassett Gibbon's Scott Square trilogy and the Clay Smitham and Green Den trilogy of stories, but also Walter Scott's Rob Roy or Stevenson's The Master of Ballantrae? Why have such adaptations on mass media television, terrestrial TV, not been available since, not been made since? As far as newspapers are concerned, when I was last in touch with the former editor of the Scottish Review of Books about contemporary reviewing practices in newspapers, his despair was as palpable as his contempt for the current situation. If public discourse is as described, the condition of politics is worse. Who is the Minister for the Arts in Scotland? And what is she or he doing? Before I slip into polemic, I can develop the point better by thinking back to my earlier proposition that what's highlighted here is the provenance of literature and the arts beyond or distinct from institutional education, government priorities, political practice. I'm just going to move on to the other image that I had there. If I can. Go here. So again, this refers to the decision that what text will be on the school's curriculum. Ultimately, this is where I'm coming to the idea of the ethics of excess. And I want to make a connection here with the American poets Charles Olson and Edward Dorn. I'll come back to that. Maybe the opposition here is between measurement and excess, the control of movement and an overflow of possibilities. It's where McDermott's extremes meet, in the space between the imagination and actual politics. In Stuart Hood's phrase, how politics is lived. As opposed to Hamish Henderson's perhaps hopelessly optimistic, poetry becomes people. It doesn't, not without a lot of help. in education and encouragement. So the social, political, state-led priorities of education, both institutionally and in media discourse, have a paramount role. The work of poets and artists is beyond such control, but animates it directly. Without that animation, stagnation, bias, thwart. Thus, the revival in Ireland and the Renaissance in Scotland began with contested claims on priority. Priority is power. The poets claim the ultimate power of unfathomable precedent. The politics and poetics of excess, expressed by MacDiarmid particularly in writing, are kept separate from the practicalities of the daily life of the man, except insofar as they kept him impoverished and cold for most of it. But there is an ethics, a moral imperative in this, from which professional politicians have led a continuing retreat, and still do. A continuous bombardment of ignorance, misinformation, disinformation, and misdirection is now the commonplace. The Renaissance foresaw this in its refashioning and repurposing of antiquity and the archaic, and in its insistence upon the value of reliable information, the regeneration that the word implies. Francis already mentioned Patrick Geddes, and it's that lineage, that genealogy, if you like, that is worth just touching on here. From the medieval art and the medieval movement into the Renaissance court of James IV, where William Dunbar was writing, through the Bannatyne manuscript to Alan Ramsay, publishing the Evergreen Anthology in 1724, which is then picked up by Patrick Geddes in the 1890s in his journal that Francis was referring to, the Evergreen, and calling for a Scottish Renaissance, which MacDiarmid then picks up on in the 1920s with reference to G. Gregory Smith and the idea of the Caledonian anticyclogy. I'm going to come back to that. That phrase, wonderfully rich and hostile as it might be, is something worth coming back to, I think. But it's curious when you think of Dunbar at James IV's court in the Thistle and the Rose offering a unionist ideal. Ramsay in 1724, post-1707, offering in some respects an imperialist ideal of expansion, of resuscitation and expansion. And then Geddes and MacDiarmid in the 1920s, and Geddes, remember, chaired the first reading that MacDiarmid gave in Edinburgh in the 1920s, with Francis George Scott there playing the settings of MacDiarmid's poems in the 1920s. So that process of regeneration is literally highlighted in that sequence of events. But there's something else we have to bear in mind in this story of the relationship between the world, the real world, politics, the real politics, and the work of the artists and writers of the Scottish Renaissance. It arises in the aftermath of the First World War. Any consideration of its political impact has to keep that historical moment in mind. MacDiarmid puts it in 1927, it took the full force of the war to jolt an adequate majority of the Scottish people out of their old mental, moral, and material ruts. The Scottish Renaissance movement regards itself as an effort in every respect of the national life, to supplant the elements at present predominant by the other elements they have suppressed, and thus reverse the existing order. And he's not just talking about poems here. But it offers a vision which in another way we can see regenerating itself later, in the aftermath of the Second World War, specific geographical or topographical preferences within Scotland being highlighted by individual poets. In the aftermath of the 1980s or 1970s and 80s, gender and sexual identity and the experience that those identities bring into poetry and literature predominating. And then since then, the priorities of ecology and the ways in which the media that are online and IT have altered the ways in which literary and artistic discourse promulgates itself. Worth going back for a moment to Reith and the relational nature of the initial idea of television, to inform, to educate, and entertain. I've often puzzled about those three words and how they're formulated in that phrase: to inform, to educate, and entertain. And I think the key people don't seem to recognize very much is the word "and." Educate and entertain go together. Inform is a different thing. Information, data, facts, reliable, just, true facts encompass all of this, but how are facts and truths related through the arts which entertain but also educate? To paraphrase Amiel Alcalay from his book A Little History from 2013, the systemic failure of government, political populism, as it permeates the imagination, is intended to short-circuit, curtail, and derail any kind of knowledge that might lead to or prompt changes in political and cultural consciousness. It erects restrictive forms of behavior. By this, works of art or aesthetic objects give opportunities for challenging encounters, while the public learns little about why things are written and the vast tradition of which they are part. What we are now most in need of, he says, is the extra literary, the poetics and polemics, letters and newspaper exchanges, biographies and gossip, and all the barnacles and detritus that go into stimulating a culture densely within its time and place. It could multiply examples referring to not only McDermott and Grassic Gibbon, but Neil Gunn, who's been mentioned already, but also Helen Adam, or John Duncan Ferguson, or William Johnston, F.G. Scott, or Eric Chisholm. By biographies, I think what Alcalay means is not just perhaps the sensational biographies that are, or biography that's pretty much in the airwaves now, but the biography of McDermott, the new biography of McDermott that's being written by Alexander Linklater, new ways of humanizing these individual characters and not turning them into icons. So just one further example of the kind of opposition that we have here is this, which appeared in the Sunday Times this last Sunday. Let's fund the future, not the past, an article by Gabriella Bennett from the 15th of January. In other words, don't bother to try and find the finances to maintain the upkeep and keep watertight the cottage in which Hugh McDermott and his wife Valda lived from 1951 until their deaths. Don't bother with that. That's the past. Use the money that might be raised to fund young writers, of whom we know nothing. Or we might polemically paraphrase, let's eradicate the past and embrace vacuity. Confronted with reaction and repudiation, we're thrown back to the terms of the whole symposium, everything, all the wonderful papers that I've been happy to listen into and take part in the conversations about in this entire symposium. The politics of revival and Renaissance. And just those two words, revival and Renaissance, to revivify and to regenerate. And this is where I want to go back for a moment, and I'll draw to an end shortly, but just for a moment to go back to the Caledonian antisyzygy and Francis's references to Dunbar and Paul's references to Dunbar. In Émile Malle's magisterial study of religious art in the 13th century France, the Gothic image, the opening sentence says, to the Middle Ages, art was didactic. And he means all the arts, from music through paintings and literature to architecture. And he reminds us that every engagement with the arts has didactic purpose. They have to be entertaining in Reith's formulation in order to teach. And they teach how life is multifaceted and ultimately uncontrollable, how the irrational imposes itself inexplicably upon the best ideals of rational humanity, which is one reason why the term Gothic was originally pejorative and opposed to the ethos of certainty and the assurance promulgated by classicism. I think this is one of the reasons why McDermott says, not Burns Dunbar or back to Dunbar. And also why the Caledonian antisyzygy, the phrase that he takes from Gregory Smith, if you look at it in its original source, it's referring to what Gregory Smith calls the propriety, the absolute propriety of a grinning gargoyle beside a saint in the sculpture and the architecture of a great cathedral. Putting these two things together, that opposition, that bringing together of these opposites, not the future, not the future at the expense of the past, but to understand the complexity of this. And the idea, of course, to answer Miss Gabriella Bennett, is that if you don't fund past, there is no future. So we're just going to come towards an end with this idea that we can identify clearly, I think, if we have an understanding of revival and Renaissance, what these words mean, to recover this educative and political understanding, we should be able to see what the twofold ethos of the artistic production we've been talking about enacts or performs. First, to identify clearly where and when political actions, developments, and initiatives have taken place and might yet take form. And second, where and when and how mass media, public discourse can carry forward the work of the artists who create the revival and/or the Renaissance. So far, so coherent, I think, a construction. But here's the last point, or the second to last point. If you subtract that insistence upon direct political purpose and public media and concentrate only on the arts, what's left? Quite a lot, I think. Guy Davenport, the American critic, says, "I think we need a revolution here and now. I want us to be a free, happy, wise people. But how this is to be achieved, I do not know. I do know that the real revolution must be a ripeness evolution. What scares me is that for the past 50 years, we've been moving backward while we have dreamed or fooled ourselves that we're moving forward. Every one of our cities became more dangerous to live in. We all became a little more than consumers and taxpayers as far as our government is concerned. Rascality in government has become the norm rather than the exception. Wars have gotten longer, more demoralizing, more devastating, and irrational. Despite every attempt of satire to keep us sane, this is Davenport writing in the 1990s, I think, have put Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George Bush in the White House. Supply your own names. It's not so much that we betrayed ourselves in putting them there. We began doing that when the ink was still wet on the Declaration of Independence portent. But that we betrayed the critical sense which satire exists to educate, that would have kept us from electing the wrongest people to the executive chair of the Republic. There are aspects that can be brought forward in the wee clip of McDermott on the TV program from 1977 that's going the rounds and it's available on YouTube, where he says he's out for independence as he was, but that's not a new idea. But the majority of the Scottish people don't want that. The majority of the Scottish people don't know any more than they've ever known what they want. In any case, they couldn't want what I stand for, because until quite recently, Scottish schools, colleges and universities has no courses in Scottish literature or the Scottish languages. They were entirely conditioned by English standards. We must have a fresh start, de novo. In other words, poetry, the work of all the arts, is a major fact of any society, but no less important politically is education. And this is the work of all people, but particularly educational institutions and the politicians charged with helping make such education happen. When McDermott says in 1977, until quite recently, we should remind ourselves of the establishment of the Association for Scottish Literary Studies in 1970, and of the Department of Scottish Literature at the University of Glasgow in 1971. For him to say that in 1977, he knew what he was talking about. That's the year just before the first devolution referendum, of course, and the election of Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative government in that era. And incidentally, it's the year that I met him. So finally, the answers, the arts, political purpose, to help people to live, to develop historical knowledge and critical thinking, to form an organization of social energy, the flood that they set in motion that may at any moment in favorable conditions reverse its directions. And if we were specific, to say of writing that Shakespeare sets out to describe the world, Shelley sets out to reform it, Keats sets out to escape from it, or to say of Tolstoy that we watch him, his writing, of Balzac that we listen to him, his writing, of Conrad that we experience how he writes, of James Joyce that we follow his writing. These are different ways of writing, of constructing reality. How do we relate to this politically through these means? Of McDermott, of Francis Gibbon, of Neil Gunn, of Jessie Kesson, of Nan Shepherd, of Helen Adam. How do we read these people in such terms? Okay, a friend of Davenport's once was dared to, in the 1940s, to call St. Elizabeth's and ask to speak to Ezra Pound. One evening she did. She called. An attendant answered and said he would fetch the patient to the phone. After a while, she heard the voice of Ezra Pound. "Start a renaissance," it said, and he hung up. Renaissance, a re-beginning, a finding of lost things, a taking up of dropped continuities. Pound's cantos begin with the word "and." William Carlos Williams Patterson, and the very title implies pater, father in Latin plus the English son, begins with a colon, punctuation mark indicating that what follows is a logical derivation from what precedes. And then Memoriam, James Joyce begins, I remember. Remember what? Remember how you laughed like hell when I read to you someone's notion that English would one day become the universal language. I'm going to end with a short poem, which I gained permission from the Charles Olson estate to make use of in this paraphrase of Olson's poem. So if we're talking about revival and Renaissance, here we go, McDermott's language. You can see McDermott's language advancing in directions of production, which were probably never guessed at, and which symbols and allegories are evidences of, no more unusual than the substance needed for them to work. Aid and abetment to help recognition of forms weak in proportion to the size of the substance. That is, for a rose to fall, for the trees to blaze in autumn for them missing, for the rivers to unsound their secrets and come down, it takes the earth, even in this sophisticated society. Thanks.